What if God was orchestrating events centuries before they happened? What if every coincidence in history was actually divine appointment? There's a book in the Bible that never mentions God's name once, yet his fingerprints are on every page. A story where prophetic timing meets human courage, where ancient lots cast for destruction become the very dates of deliverance. Here, an orphaned Jewish girl rises to save her people not through miracles or angels, but through wisdom, boldness, and supernatural positioning. The enemy's own trap becomes his grave. The king's insomnia becomes a nation's salvation. Every detail screams, for such a time as this. You're about to witness how the Almighty moves in shadows, turning curses into blessings and transforming intended genocide into glorious victory. This is Esther, where prophecy meets providence. Picture the greatest party in human history. King Ahasuerus ruled from his throne in Susa, and his empire was massive beyond imagination. When chapter 1 verse 1 tells us his kingdom stretched from India to Kush over 127 provinces, we're talking about the biggest empire the world had ever seen. This wasn't just any king. He controlled 3 continents and ruled over millions of people. In the 3rd year of his reign, Xerxes decided to throw a celebration that would make everyone remember his power forever. As chapter 1 verse 3 records, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. But this wasn't a simple dinner party or weekend celebration. The festivities lasted for 180 days. That's 6 full months of continuous partying, eating, drinking, and displaying wealth. Every single day for half a year, the king opened his treasuries and showed off his incredible riches. The palace courtyards were transformed into the most luxurious party venue anyone had ever imagined. Golden drinking cups filled the tables, each one crafted differently, so no 2 guests drank from identical vessels. Purple and white linen curtains hung from silver rings attached to marble pillars. Guests didn't sit on simple chairs. They reclined on couches made of pure gold and silver. The Bible gives us incredible detail about this display in chapter 1, verse 6. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. The floor itself was artwork, a mosaic made from the most expensive stones in the ancient world. Guests walked on precious gems while eating from golden plates and drinking from jeweled cups. But this wasn't just showing off for fun. Every noble, every military leader, every provincial governor could see exactly what resources King Xerxes commanded. When they returned to their provinces, they would tell everyone about the unimaginable wealth they had witnessed. The message was clear. Rebellion against this king was impossible because his resources were unlimited. This party was politics disguised as celebration, demonstrating beyond any doubt who held absolute power in the ancient world. After impressing his officials for 180 days, the king wasn't finished celebrating. He decided to throw one final week-long party, but this time it wasn't just for government leaders. Everyone living in Susa was invited. Chapter 1 verse 5 tells us, when these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. Rich merchants, poor servants, important officials, ordinary citizens, absolutely everyone could come feast in the royal palace gardens. While the king entertained the men, Queen Vashti held her own elegant celebration for the women inside the royal palace. Everything was going perfectly until the 7th day, when something went terribly wrong. The king had been drinking wine for days and was feeling particularly proud of his kingdom and possessions. He had shown off his gold, his silver, his precious stones, and his magnificent palace. But he had one more treasure to display: his beautiful queen. Chapter 1, verse 10 records the fateful command. On the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. The 7 eunuchs hurried to deliver the king's message to Queen Vashti. But when they arrived and explained that the king wanted her to come before all his guests wearing only her royal crown, something unprecedented happened. Queen Vashti looked at these messengers and said no. Chapter 1, verse 12 simply states, "But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger." Her refusal sent shockwaves through the palace. No one, absolutely no one, had ever defied King Xerxes like this, especially not in front of hundreds of guests from across the empire. The king didn't know what to do. His advisors immediately understood that this wasn't just about one woman refusing one command. This was a constitutional crisis that could shake the foundation of their entire society. The king's advisor Memucan explained the danger in chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, "King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come." This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. The advisors convinced the king that Vashti's rebellion could inspire women throughout the entire empire to disobey their husbands. If the queen could refuse the king, why shouldn't every wife refuse her husband? Chapter 1, verses 19 and 20 record their solution. "Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest." The decision was swift and brutal. Queen Vashti lost everything: her crown, her position, her home, and her marriage. She was banished forever, never again allowed in the king's presence. The empire needed a new queen. With Queen Vashti permanently removed from the palace, King Xerxes needed a replacement. His personal attendants came up with a plan that had never been attempted before: a kingdom-wide search for the most beautiful young women in the entire Persian Empire. This wasn't going to be a simple local competition. They were talking about searching through 127 provinces across 3 continents to find the perfect new queen. Chapter 2, verses 2 through 4 detail their ambitious proposal. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Immediately, royal commissioners departed for every corner of the empire with orders to find the most gorgeous young women in each province. They traveled to India in the east, to Ethiopia in the south, to Greece in the west, and to every territory in between. In each city and town, they searched for young women who might catch the king's eye. Hundreds of girls were selected and brought to Susa for the unprecedented royal beauty competition. Among all these young women was someone very special, a Jewish girl living right there in Susa with her older cousin. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, which means myrtle, but everyone knew her by her Persian name, Esther, which means star. She was an orphan who had lost both parents when she was young. Chapter 2, verses 5 through 7 introduce us to this remarkable family. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Mordecai came from the tribe of Benjamin, the same tribe that had produced Israel's first king, Saul. His family had been exiled to Babylon years earlier when Jerusalem was conquered. But instead of returning to Jerusalem when they had the chance, they had stayed in Persia and built a new life there. When Esther's parents died, Mordecai didn't hesitate to adopt her and raise her as his own daughter. She grew up in his home, learning his values and following his guidance in everything. When the king's commissioners arrived in Susa looking for beautiful young women to join the royal competition, they noticed Esther immediately. Her beauty was absolutely stunning, and according to chapter 2, verse 8, she was taken to the king's palace and placed under the care of Hegai, who was in charge of the harem. But before she left for the palace, Mordecai gave her one crucial instruction that would change the entire course of history. Keep your Jewish identity secret. Chapter 2, verse 10 reveals this hidden truth. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. In a palace filled with young women from every nation and culture in the Persian Empire, Esther carried a secret that could either save her people or destroy her chances of survival. Nobody in the palace knew that this beautiful Persian girl was actually a Jewish orphan whose family had been exiled from Jerusalem. Mordecai wasn't the type of guardian to simply send Esther to the palace and hope everything worked out. He understood that knowledge was power in the Persian court, and he knew that staying informed about palace politics could mean the difference between life and death. So he developed a strategy that was both protective and brilliant. Every single day, without fail, Mordecai positioned himself near the palace where he could gather information and stay connected to what was happening with Esther. Chapter 2, verse 11 describes his daily routine. Every day, he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. This wasn't just the anxious pacing of a worried father figure. Mordecai was systematically building an intelligence network inside the royal palace. His chosen position at the palace gate was strategically perfect. The gate area was where officials gathered, where messengers came and went, where servants passed through carrying news and gossip from different parts of the palace. By spending time there every day, Mordecai could observe the flow of people, overhear important conversations, and gradually build relationships with palace workers who could keep him informed about Esther's situation. But Mordecai's intelligence gathering served a deeper purpose than just staying informed. He was making sure that even though Esther was physically separated from him inside the harem, she could still receive his guidance and counsel. Through this network of contacts and communication, he could continue to advise her on crucial decisions, especially the vital importance of keeping her Jewish identity hidden. The Bible emphasizes how carefully Esther followed Mordecai's ongoing instructions in chapter 2, verse 20. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. Even as she prepared to potentially become the most powerful woman in the Persian Empire, Esther maintained absolute loyalty to Mordecai's wisdom and guidance. This communication system between cousin and guardian was creating something neither of them fully realized yet. They were establishing the foundation for a network that could operate at the highest levels of Persian government. Mordecai would serve as Esther's eyes and ears in the broader palace environment, while she would eventually become his voice in the most exclusive circles of royal power. They were building infrastructure that would soon prove essential for the survival of their entire people. The royal beauty preparation process was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Each young woman who entered the competition had to spend an entire year getting ready before she could even meet the king. This wasn't just a few weeks of preparation, it was 12 full months of intensive beauty treatments designed to make each candidate as attractive as possible. Chapter 2, verses 12 and 13 explain this elaborate process. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women. 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. The first 6 months focused on oil of myrrh, an expensive, sweet-smelling substance that softened skin and gave it a beautiful glow. Myrrh was so valuable that it was often worth more than gold. For half a year, these young women received daily treatments with this precious oil. Then came another 6 months with various perfumes and cosmetics, each designed to enhance their natural beauty and make them irresistible to the king. During this year of preparation, something important was happening with Esther. Hegai, the eunuch in charge of all the women, began to notice something special about her. Chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 tell us, when the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Hegai's favor was incredibly valuable. He had seen hundreds of beautiful women come through the palace, and he knew exactly what King Xerxes liked. When Esther's turn finally came to meet the king, she made a decision that set her apart from all the other candidates. While the other women asked for expensive jewelry, elaborate clothing, and costly accessories to impress the king, Esther took a different approach. Chapter 2, verse 15 reveals her wisdom. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king. She asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She trusted the expert who knew the king's preferences better than anyone. The moment King Xerxes saw Esther, the competition was over. Chapter 2, verses 16 and 17 record what happened. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The king was so delighted with his new queen that he threw another massive celebration. Chapter 2, verse 18 tells us, and the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. The entire empire celebrated their new queen with feasting, holidays, and gifts. But even in this moment of ultimate triumph, even as the golden crown was placed on her head and she became the most powerful woman in the known world, Esther kept her most important secret. The new queen of Persia was Jewish, and absolutely nobody in the palace knew except her cousin Mordecai, who continued his daily watch at the palace gate, while Esther was adjusting to her new life as queen, learning palace protocols and royal responsibilities. Mordecai continued his daily routine of gathering intelligence at the palace gate. His position there had given him access to an incredible network of palace servants, guards, and officials. This web of connections was about to prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. One day, while Mordecai was sitting in his usual spot, observing the flow of palace life, he overheard something that made his blood run cold. Two of the king's most trusted officers were having a conversation they thought was private, but Mordecai was close enough to hear every word. Bigthana and Teresh, who were doorkeepers with direct access to the king's private chambers, were plotting to assassinate King Xerxes. Chapter 2, verse 21 describes this crucial discovery. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. These weren't random servants with wild ideas. They were highly placed security officers who actually had the opportunity to carry out their deadly plan. They had access to the king's rooms, they knew his schedule, and they were in positions of trust that would allow them to get close enough to kill him. Mordecai understood immediately that this wasn't just gossip or angry talk. This was a real conspiracy that could succeed. But he faced a serious problem. How could a Jewish man sitting at the palace gate report an assassination plot directly to the king? He had no official position, no way to request an audience, and no reason to believe that anyone would take his word seriously against two trusted royal officers. Fortunately, Mordecai had something much better than direct access to the king. He had Queen Esther. Their communication network, which had been established during her year of preparation, was still functioning perfectly. Mordecai immediately sent word to Esther about the assassination plot, and she understood the urgency of the situation without needing explanation. Chapter 2, verse 22 tells us what happened next. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. Esther didn't try to take credit for discovering the conspiracy. Instead, she made sure the king knew that the information came from Mordecai, establishing his credibility and loyalty in the royal court. The king took the warning seriously and immediately ordered a full investigation. His security officials questioned both Bigthana and Teresh thoroughly, examined their backgrounds, and uncovered evidence that confirmed Mordecai's report. Chapter 2, verse 23 records the swift justice that followed, and when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. The conspiracy was crushed. The king's life was saved, and most importantly, Mordecai's loyalty and alertness were officially documented in the royal chronicles. At the time, it seemed like Mordecai received no immediate reward for preventing the king's murder. The good deed was simply written down in the record books and apparently forgotten. But that single entry in the chronicle of royal history would later become the key that would unlock salvation for the entire Jewish people. Sometime after the assassination plot was discovered and resolved, King Xerxes made a decision that would change the entire political landscape of his empire. He chose to promote one of his nobles to the highest position in the kingdom, second only to the king himself. The man he selected for this incredible honor was Haman, son of Hammedatha, who was identified as an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekites, ancient enemies of the Jewish people. Chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 explain what happened. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. This wasn't just a promotion or a raise in salary. This was an elevation to a position of power that was unprecedented in Persian history. But Haman's new position came with a requirement that revealed something disturbing about his character and ambitions. The king didn't simply command that people respect Haman or obey his orders. He commanded that everyone must bow down before him. This wasn't ordinary respect for a government official. This was worship. Every person who worked in the palace, every official who served the government, every individual who had business at the royal court was required to fall on their knees when Haman passed by. Day after day, the scene repeated itself throughout the palace complex. When Haman walked through the corridors, everyone immediately dropped to their knees. Guards fell prostrate on their faces. Government officials bowed low until their foreheads touched the ground. Servants threw themselves down in submission. The entire Persian government was literally worshipping this one man who had won the king's favor. The command was absolute. The expectations were crystal clear, and everyone understood that disobedience would have severe consequences. In the Persian Empire, when King Xerxes issued an order, it was followed without question or delay. Failure to comply with royal commands could result in imprisonment, exile, or death. Haman's elevation to this position of universal worship created an environment where religious conviction would soon collide directly with political requirement. What made this situation even more significant was Haman's ancestry. As an Agagite, he was descended from King Agag of the Amalekites, the same people who had attacked the Israelites when they were fleeing from Egypt centuries earlier. God had commanded King Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites, but Saul had disobeyed and allowed King Agag to live. Now, hundreds of years later, a descendant of that same enemy was demanding worship from the descendants of those same Israelites. The ancient conflict between these two peoples was about to explode into a life-and-death struggle that would determine the survival of the Jewish race. Every single day, Mordecai continued his established routine of positioning himself at the palace gate to gather information and stay connected to the flow of palace politics. And every single day, when Haman passed by in his magnificent robes, expecting worship from everyone present, something extraordinary and dangerous happened. While every other person in sight immediately fell to their knees, Mordecai remained standing upright. Chapter 3, verse 2, describes this daily act of defiance. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Day after day, week after week, the same scene played out. Haman would approach with his entourage, expecting the usual universal submission, and there would be Mordecai, the one person in the entire palace complex who refused to bow down. He stood out like a lone tree in an empty field, impossible to ignore or overlook. The other palace officials noticed this defiance immediately and were horrified by what they saw. They understood the danger Mordecai was creating for himself, and they tried repeatedly to reason with him. Why was he putting his life at risk over something that seemed so simple? Everyone else was following the king's command. Why couldn't he just bow down like everybody else and avoid trouble? Chapter 3, verse 3 shows their growing concern. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" They weren't asking out of curiosity. They were genuinely worried about what would happen when Haman discovered this ongoing act of rebellion. They knew that defying a direct royal command was essentially signing your own death warrant, but Mordecai wouldn't budge from his position. Day after day they questioned him, trying to convince him to save his own life by simply bending his knee when Haman passed by. Finally, Mordecai gave them the answer that explained everything. Chapter 3, verse 4 tells us, "Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. For he had told them he was a Jew." There it was, the reason behind Mordecai's stubborn refusal. This wasn't about pride, stubbornness, or personal dislike of Haman. This was about faith. As a Jew, Mordecai believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had been taught from childhood that worship belonged to God alone. No matter what the consequences might be, he could not and would not bow down and worship any human being, no matter how powerful or important they might be. when the other officials finally told Haman about this Jewish man who was deliberately and publicly refusing to honor him. Haman's reaction was explosive and revealing. Chapter 3, verse 5 describes his fury when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. He was enraged. This wasn't just anger or irritation. This was pure, burning rage that consumed Haman's thoughts and emotions. But here's what made Haman truly dangerous. His anger didn't stop with thoughts of personal revenge against one defiant individual. His rage was so intense and his hatred so deep that it expanded into something much more sinister and evil. Chapter 3, verse 6 reveals the horrifying scope of his malice. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews. Throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, what had started as one faithful man's refusal to worship a human being had now become the foundation for genocide against an entire race of people. Haman's wounded pride had transformed into a plot to exterminate every single Jewish person living anywhere in the Persian Empire. One man's act of religious conscience had triggered a response that would threaten the survival of God's chosen people. Throughout the known world, Haman's hatred for the Jewish people wasn't something he acted on immediately or carelessly. He was a calculating, methodical planner who understood that timing would be everything in carrying out such a massive operation. The destruction of an entire people group across 127 provinces required careful planning and, in Haman's superstitious mind, divine approval from the gods. In the first month of the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, Haman decided to seek supernatural guidance for his evil plan. Chapter 3, verse 7 describes what happened in the 12th year of King Xerxes. In the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. The word pur meant lot in the ancient language, small stones or dice that were thrown to make decisions. Haman cast these lots day after day, month after month, asking his gods to show him the most favorable time to destroy the Jews. The lots kept indicating different dates until finally they settled on the 13th day of Adar, almost a full year away. This wasn't accidental delay. In Haman's mind, the gods were giving him time to prepare properly and gather resources for the massive undertaking. With his divine timing established, Haman approached King Xerxes with a carefully crafted proposal. He didn't mention Mordecai's name or admit that this was personal revenge. Instead, he painted the Jews as a dangerous threat to the empire's unity and security. Chapter 3, verses 8 and 9 record his manipulative presentation. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." 10,000 talents of silver was an enormous amount of money, more than most kingdoms possessed in their entire treasuries. Haman was essentially offering to finance the genocide personally, making it cost the king nothing while filling the royal coffers with incredible wealth. He presented the plan as both profitable and patriotic, a way to eliminate troublemakers, while making the empire richer. King Xerxes was convinced by Haman's argument and decided to give him complete authority to carry out the plan. Chapter 3, verse 10 tells us, "So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews." By giving Haman his signet ring, the king was essentially handing over his royal authority to seal any document or issue any command related to this matter. Haman now had unlimited power to destroy the Jewish people. With the king's signet ring in his possession, Haman wasted no time in making his genocidal plan official. He called together the royal scribes and began dictating one of the most horrifying documents in human history. This wasn't going to be a simple announcement. It was going to be a detailed set of instructions for systematic murder across the entire known world. Chapter 3, verse 12 describes the creation of this death warrant. And then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. The scribes worked frantically to translate the decree into dozens of different languages and scripts. Every province had its own local language, and every people group needed to receive the orders in words they could understand perfectly. There could be no confusion, no misunderstanding, and no excuse for not carrying out the commands exactly as specified. The content of this decree was absolutely chilling in its comprehensive evil. Chapter 3, verse 13, reveals the full scope of Haman's plan. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. This wasn't warfare against soldiers or punishment for criminals. This was the planned extermination of an entire race, men, women, elderly people, and small children. The decree even authorized the killers to take all Jewish property as payment for their participation in the massacre. Haman had turned genocide into a profitable venture for anyone willing to participate. Once the documents were completed and sealed with the king's ring, they became irreversible law. In the Persian legal system, any edict sealed with the royal signet could never be changed or cancelled, not even by the king himself. Thousands of copies were made and given to fast couriers who rode day and night to deliver the death sentences to every corner of the empire. Chapter 3, verse 15 describes how quickly the news spread. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. While Haman and the king celebrated their decision with wine, the ordinary people of Susa were confused and troubled by what they had heard. Many of them knew Jewish families and couldn't understand why these peaceful neighbors were suddenly marked for death. When Mordecai learned about the decree calling for the destruction of his people, his reaction was immediate and dramatic. This wasn't the time for quiet grief or private prayer. The situation called for public, visible mourning that would draw attention to the terrible injustice that had been set in motion. Chapter 4, verse 1 describes Mordecai's response. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. Tearing clothes was a traditional sign of grief in Jewish culture, but Mordecai went further. He put on rough sackcloth and covered himself with ashes, the most extreme form of mourning possible. Then he walked through the streets of Susa, crying out in anguish so loudly that everyone could hear him. This public display wasn't just emotional release. It was strategic communication. Mordecai knew that news of his dramatic mourning would eventually reach Queen Esther in the palace. He positioned himself as close to the royal complex as possible, making sure his grief couldn't be ignored or hidden. Chapter 4, verse 2 tells us exactly where he went. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. Palace protocol strictly forbade anyone dressed in mourning clothes from entering the royal grounds. The king's court was supposed to be a place of joy and celebration, not sadness and grief. So Mordecai stood right at the boundary, as close as he could get to Esther, while making his protest as visible as possible. Mordecai wasn't alone in his mourning. Throughout the empire, as news of the decree spread, Jewish communities erupted in grief and fear. Chapter 4, verse 3 describes the widespread reaction. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. From India to Ethiopia, in every major city and small town where Jews lived, the same scene was playing out. Families gathered together, tearing their clothes and crying out to God for help. Synagogues became centers of fasting and prayer as entire communities sought divine intervention. The mourning was so widespread and so public that it couldn't be hidden from the general population. Inside the palace, Queen Esther's servants brought her disturbing news about Mordecai's condition. Chapter 4, verse 4 records her initial response. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Esther's first instinct was to help Mordecai look presentable, so he could enter the palace and explain what was wrong. But when he refused the clean clothes, she realized something much more serious was happening. Desperate to understand what was causing Mordecai's dramatic public mourning, Esther sent one of her trusted servants to find out what had happened. She chose Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been assigned to serve her, and gave him specific instructions to learn exactly what was troubling her cousin. Chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 describe this crucial conversation. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai didn't hold anything back. He told Hathach everything about Haman's hatred, about the decree calling for Jewish extermination, even about the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the privilege of destroying an entire people. Chapter 4, verse 7 states, Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. But Mordecai went beyond just sharing information. He gave Hathach a copy of the actual decree that was being circulated throughout the empire, and he sent a specific message to Queen Esther about what she needed to do. Chapter 4, verses 8 and 9 record his urgent request. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. When Esther heard this message, she faced an impossible choice that could cost her everything. She wanted to help her people, but there was a major problem. She couldn't just walk into the king's presence whenever she wanted to. Persian royal protocol had strict rules about approaching the king, and breaking these rules could result in immediate death. Esther sent Hathach back to Mordecai with a message explaining the danger she faced. Chapter 4, verses 10 through 12 record her response. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Esther hadn't been summoned to see her husband, the king, for an entire month. This meant she had no way of knowing what kind of mood he was in or whether he would be pleased to see her. If she approached the throne uninvited and the king didn't extend his golden scepter toward her, she would be executed on the spot. She would die without even having the chance to explain why she had come or to plead for her people's lives. The queen of the Persian Empire was trapped by the very protocols that were supposed to protect royal dignity. She could remain safe in her palace and watch her people be destroyed, or she could risk her life on the chance that the king might listen to her plea. Either choice could result in the death of countless innocent people. When Mordecai received Esther's message about the danger of approaching the king uninvited, he understood that she was frightened and looking for a way to avoid taking such a terrible risk. But this was not the time for caution or self-preservation. The survival of their entire people was at stake, and Esther was the only person in the empire who might be able to change the king's mind. Mordecai's response to Esther's fears was one of the most powerful speeches in the entire Bible. It combined harsh truth with prophetic insight, warning her about the consequences of silence, while also reminding her of her unique purpose and position. Chapter 4, verses 13 and 14 record Mordecai's crucial message. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will come from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Mordecai's words cut through any illusion Esther might have had about her own safety. Just because she was queen didn't mean she would survive the genocide. When Haman's men came to kill the Jews, they wouldn't make exceptions for royal family members whose Jewish identity had been kept secret. Her hidden heritage, which had protected her during the selection process, would become her death sentence when the day of destruction arrived. But Mordecai didn't stop with warnings about personal danger. He also delivered a prophetic promise that revealed his deep faith in God's protection of his chosen people. Even if Esther remained silent, deliverance would come from somewhere else. God would not allow his people to be completely destroyed, because he had made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that could not be broken. However, if Esther refused to act when she had the opportunity and the position to make a difference, she and her family would not be part of that divine rescue. They would perish along with all the other Jews who failed to receive God's protection. Then came the most famous line in the entire book of Esther. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Mordecai was suggesting that Esther's entire life story, her parents' death, her adoption by him, her selection as queen, her hidden Jewish identity, might all have been part of a divine plan to place her in exactly the right position at exactly the right moment to save her people. This wasn't random coincidence or lucky timing. This was the hand of God working through seemingly ordinary events to accomplish his purposes. All the circumstances that had brought Esther to the throne might have been preparation for this one crucial moment when the survival of the Jewish people would depend on her courage and faith. After receiving Mordecai's prophetic challenge, Esther made a decision that would change the course of history. She chose to risk her life for her people, but first she wanted to prepare spiritually for what she knew would be the most important conversation of her life. She understood that approaching the king required more than just courage. It required divine intervention. Chapter 4, verse 16 records Esther's response. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther called for something unprecedented, a city-wide fast involving every Jewish person living in Susa. This wasn't just about her personal preparation. She wanted the entire Jewish community to join together in seeking God's help for what she was about to attempt. For 3 full days and nights, hundreds of Jewish families would stop all normal activities and focus entirely on prayer. The decision to fast for 3 days showed Esther's understanding of spiritual warfare. She knew that what she was facing wasn't just a political problem or a diplomatic challenge. This was a battle between good and evil, between God's purposes and Satan's attempts to destroy God's chosen people. Physical preparation wasn't enough. She needed spiritual strength that could only come from God. During these 3 days, Esther and her servants would join the community fast, giving up all food and water while seeking God's wisdom and protection. This was serious spiritual discipline that required real sacrifice and demonstrated absolute dependence on God's power rather than human strength or cleverness. The phrase, "And if I perish," revealed the depth of Esther's commitment. She had counted the cost and decided that saving her people was worth risking her own life. She wasn't going to approach the king with a backup plan or safety net. She was willing to die if necessary to give her people a chance to live. Chapter 5, verse 1 tells us what happened when the 3 days of fasting ended. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. After 3 days of fasting and prayer, Esther dressed in her most beautiful royal clothing and walked toward the throne room, knowing that each step could be her last. As Esther stood in the inner court wearing her royal robes, her heart must have been pounding with fear and hope. She had broken royal protocol by approaching without invitation, and now everything depended on the king's reaction. If he was angry or distracted, if he viewed her approach as disrespectful or inappropriate, she would be killed immediately without any chance to explain her mission. Chapter 5, verse 2 describes the moment that changed everything. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king's pleasure at seeing his beautiful wife was immediate and obvious. Instead of anger at her presumption, he felt delight at her presence. The golden scepter extended toward her was both a sign of forgiveness for breaking protocol and an invitation to approach his throne safely. Touching the tip of the scepter was Esther's formal acceptance of the king's mercy and protection. She was no longer in danger of execution. But now came the critical moment. What would she say? How could she explain why she had risked her life to see him? The king was clearly in a good mood and ready to grant her request, whatever it might be. Chapter 5, verse 3 records the king's generous offer. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." This was an incredibly generous promise. The king was essentially telling Esther that no request would be too large, no favor too expensive. He was prepared to give her anything she wanted, up to half of his vast empire, but Esther surprised everyone with her answer. Instead of immediately revealing her desperate need or explaining the crisis facing her people, she made what seemed like a simple social request. Chapter 5, verse 4 tells us, "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." This invitation was brilliant strategy disguised as social courtesy. By inviting both the king and Haman to a private dinner, Esther was creating the perfect setting for what she needed to accomplish. The king would be relaxed and happy after good food and wine. Haman would be present so she could make her accusations directly. And the intimate setting would allow for the kind of personal conversation that would be impossible in the formal throne room. The king was delighted by the invitation and immediately accepted. Chapter 5, verse 5 records his enthusiasm. "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." The king was so eager to attend Esther's banquet that he wanted Haman brought immediately so they could go together right away. The royal banquet was everything Esther had hoped it would be. The king enjoyed the food, the wine, and the company of his beautiful queen. The atmosphere was relaxed and festive, perfect for granting favors and making generous promises. As the evening progressed, the king became increasingly eager to show his appreciation for Esther's hospitality. Chapter 5, verse 6 records the king's repeated offer. As they were drinking wine, The king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Once again, the king promised to give Esther anything she wanted, up to half of his empire. He was clearly in an excellent mood and ready to be incredibly generous. But once again, Esther surprised everyone by not revealing her true request. Instead, she made another invitation that delayed the crucial conversation for one more day. Chapter 5, verses 7 and 8 record her response. Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Esther's decision to wait one more day wasn't hesitation or fear, it was wisdom. She wanted to make absolutely sure that the timing was perfect and that both men would be in the right frame of mind for what she needed to tell them. Another day would give her more time to prepare, and it would build anticipation that would make her eventual request even more dramatic. Haman left the banquet feeling incredibly proud and important. Being invited to eat privately with the king and queen made him feel like he was part of the royal family. Chapter 5, verse 9 describes his mood. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Even in his moment of triumph, Haman's happiness was ruined by Mordecai's continued defiance. The sight of that Jewish man still refusing to bow, still showing no fear or respect, drove Haman into another rage. His joy from the royal banquet was completely overshadowed by his hatred for this one stubborn individual who wouldn't acknowledge his importance. When Haman arrived home, he called together his friends and his wife Zeresh to brag about his incredible success and high position. Chapter 5, verses 10 through 12 record his boasting. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. "And that's not all," Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow." But even after listing all his accomplishments and honors, Haman admitted that none of it satisfied him as long as Mordecai remained defiant. Chapter 5, verse 13 reveals his obsession. "But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." Haman's wife and friends had a suggestion that seemed perfect for solving his problem. Chapter 5, verse 14 records their advice. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. 50 cubits was about 75 feet high, a massive structure that would be visible from all over Susa. This wasn't just about killing Mordecai. It was about making his death as public and humiliating as possible. Haman wanted everyone in the city to see what happened to people who refused to show him proper respect. That very night, workers began constructing the enormous gallows in Haman's yard, preparing for Mordecai's execution the next morning. That same night, while Haman was building his gallows and dreaming of Mordecai's death, something strange happened in the royal palace. King Xerxes couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his royal bed, but sleep wouldn't come. This wasn't just ordinary restlessness. This was divine intervention at work in ways the king couldn't understand. Chapter 6. Verse 1 describes what happened next. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. When ancient kings couldn't sleep, they often had servants read to them from historical records. It was like listening to boring government reports, usually guaranteed to put anyone to sleep within minutes. But this night was different. As the servant began reading through the royal chronicles, he came across an entry that caught the king's attention immediately. It was the record of Mordecai's report about the assassination plot that had saved the king's life years earlier. The entry was brief but clear. A Jewish man named Mordecai had discovered a conspiracy and reported it through Queen Esther, preventing the king's murder. Chapter 6, verse 2, records what the chronicles contained. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. The king listened carefully as the servant read about how his life had been saved by this man's alertness and loyalty. Then the king asked a question that changed everything. Chapter 6, verse 3 tells us, "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" The king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. The king was shocked to discover that the man who had saved his life had never received any reward, recognition, or honor. This was completely against Persian custom, which demanded that loyal service be rewarded generously. King Xerxes immediately decided that this oversight needed to be corrected. A man who had saved the king's life deserved the highest honors the empire could offer. But it was the middle of the night, and the king needed advice about what kind of reward would be appropriate for such extraordinary loyalty and service. Just as the king was wondering who he could consult about this important matter, his servants announced that someone was in the outer court requesting an audience. Chapter 6, verse 4 reveals who it was. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. Perfect timing, or was it? Haman had come early to the palace, eager to get permission to execute Mordecai before attending the queen's banquet. He wanted to start his day with the satisfaction of seeing his enemy dead. But instead of finding an opportunity to request Mordecai's execution, he was about to walk into a situation that would completely destroy his plans. When the king's servants announced that Haman was in the outer court, King Xerxes immediately ordered him to be brought in. This was exactly what the king needed. His highest-ranking advisor was available to help him plan the perfect reward for Mordecai's life-saving service. Chapter 6, verse 5 describes Haman's entrance. So Haman entered, and the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" The king didn't mention Mordecai's name or explain what service had earned his gratitude. He simply asked Haman to suggest an appropriate way to honor someone who had pleased the king greatly. Haman's ego immediately took control of his thinking. Who else could the king possibly want to honor except Haman himself? After all, hadn't he just been invited to 2 private banquets with the king and queen? Wasn't he the most powerful man in the empire after the king? Obviously, this was the king's way of asking Haman what kind of reward he would like to receive. Chapter 6, verse 6 records Haman's arrogant assumption. Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" This moment of pride was about to lead to his complete humiliation, but Haman had no idea what was coming. He was so consumed with his own importance that he couldn't imagine the king wanting to honor anyone else. Since Haman believed the king was asking him to design his own reward ceremony, he decided to suggest the most lavish honors possible. He wanted treatment that would make him appear almost royal, like a prince or a member of the king's own family. Chapter 6, verses 7 through 9 contain Haman's elaborate suggestion. So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Haman's suggestion was incredibly bold and presumptuous. He was asking to wear the king's own clothes and ride the king's own horse, honors that were usually reserved for members of the royal family. He wanted to parade through Susa looking exactly like royalty, with one of the highest nobles in the empire serving as his herald and announcing his special status to everyone in the city. The king was delighted with this suggestion. It seemed perfect for honoring the man who had saved his life. Chapter 6, verse 10 records his enthusiastic response. "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." The shock on Haman's face must have been incredible. The man he hated most in the world, the man whose execution he had come to request, was the person the king wanted to honor. Not only would Mordecai not be executed, he would be treated like royalty, and Haman himself would have to serve as his herald and servant during the parade. Chapter 6, verse 11 describes what happened next. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Every word of that proclamation must have felt like poison in Haman's mouth. But he had no choice except to obey the king's direct command. After the humiliating honor parade, Haman returned home in complete disgrace. His wife and friends, who had encouraged him to build the gallows just hours earlier, now saw disaster approaching. But there was no time to plan or strategize. Haman had to rush to Queen Esther's second banquet. Chapter 6. Verses 12 and 13 describe his condition. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisers and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Even his own family could see that something supernatural was working against him. Before Haman could recover from his shock or plan his next move, the king's servants arrived to escort him to the queen's banquet. Chapter 6, verse 14 tells us, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. This second banquet started exactly like the first one, with excellent food, wine, and pleasant conversation. But this time, Esther was ready to reveal everything. When the king repeated his generous offer to grant her request, she didn't delay any longer. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, record the moment that changed everything. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." The king was stunned. His beloved queen was asking for her life to be spared? Someone had marked her and her people for destruction. This was the first time the king realized that the decree against the Jews would include his own wife. He had signed Haman's death warrant without understanding that it condemned Queen Esther as well. Chapter 7, verse 5 records the king's shocked response. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" The king couldn't believe that anyone would be bold enough to threaten the queen's life. He demanded to know immediately who was responsible for this outrageous plot. Esther's answer was simple and devastating. Chapter 7, verse 6 tells us, Esther said, "An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. She pointed directly at Haman, identifying him as the enemy who had planned to destroy her and her people. There was no way for Haman to deny it. He had personally presented the plan to the king and received permission to carry it out. When King Xerxes realized that Haman had tricked him into signing his own wife's death warrant, his rage was explosive. The man he had trusted most had manipulated him into authorizing genocide against his beloved queen's people. The king was so furious he couldn't even stay in the room. Chapter 7, verse 7 describes his reaction. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Haman understood immediately that his deception had been exposed and his life was now in terrible danger. His only hope was to convince Esther to show him mercy. While the king paced furiously in the garden, Haman threw himself down beside Esther's couch, desperately pleading for forgiveness and begging her to save his life. But his frantic behavior looked suspicious to the returning king. Chapter 7, verse 8 records what the king saw when he returned. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. In Persian culture, covering someone's face was a sign that they were condemned to death. The servants immediately understood that Haman's execution was certain. At that moment, one of the king's officials provided information that sealed Haman's fate completely. Chapter 7, verse 9 tells us, Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, 'Impale him on it.' The same gallows Haman had built to execute Mordecai would now be used for his own execution. The irony was perfect, and the justice was swift." Chapter 7, verse 10 records the final outcome. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. The man who had plotted evil against the innocent died by the very method he had chosen for his enemy's destruction. With Haman dead, King Xerxes immediately addressed the massive problem that remained. The death decree against the Jews was still in effect, and according to Persian law, it could never be cancelled or revoked. Even the king himself couldn't change a law that had been sealed with his signet ring, but he could find another way to protect Esther's people. Chapter 8, verses 1 and 2 describe the king's first actions. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Mordecai's transformation was complete and immediate. In a single day, he went from being marked for execution to becoming the second most powerful man in the Persian Empire. He received Haman's position, his authority, his wealth, and his estate. The king's signet ring gave him the power to create new laws and issue royal decrees. But Esther understood that Haman's death and Mordecai's promotion didn't solve the fundamental problem. The original decree still condemned every Jewish person in the empire to death on the 13th day of Adar. Something more needed to be done to protect her people. Chapter 8, verses 3 through 6, record Esther's desperate plea. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" The king explained the legal problem they faced, but also pointed toward a solution. Chapter 8, verses 7 and 8 contain his response. King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole. Now write another decree in the king's name, in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." They couldn't cancel the death decree, but they could create a new decree that would give the Jews legal protection. Mordecai immediately understood what needed to be done. If the Jews were going to be attacked on the 13th day of Adar, they needed legal authority to defend themselves. The new decree would give them something they never had before: official permission to fight back against their enemies. Chapter 8, verses 9 through 11 describe the creation of this new law. At once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of every nationality and province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. This new decree was revolutionary. Instead of being helpless victims waiting for slaughter, the Jews now had legal authority to organize, arm themselves, and fight back against anyone who tried to harm them. They could form militias, gather weapons, and coordinate their defense across the entire empire. The timing was crucial. Chapter 8, verse 12 specifies the date. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. The Jews would have several months to prepare for what was coming. They could organize their communities, plan their defense strategies, and gather everything they needed to protect themselves. Chapter 8, verse 13 describes how quickly the new decree spread. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. This wasn't a secret message or hidden permission. The entire empire would know that the Jews had legal authority to defend themselves with deadly force. The effect of this new decree was immediate and dramatic. Chapter 8, verses 15 through 17 tell us, when Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had fallen on them. When the 13th day of Adar finally arrived, everything was different than Haman had planned. Instead of defenseless victims waiting to be slaughtered, the empire found well-organized, legally authorized Jewish communities ready to defend themselves against any attack. Chapter 9, verses 1 and 2 describe what happened. On the 13th day of the 12th month, The month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king, was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those who tried to destroy them. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. The fear was real and widespread. Government officials throughout the empire supported the Jews because they were afraid of Mordecai's power and influence. Chapter 9, verse 3 tells us, "And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews. Because fear of Mordecai had seized them, the battle results were overwhelming. Instead of being destroyed, the Jews became the destroyers of their enemies." Chapter 9, verses 5 and 6 record the outcome in Susa. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Among the dead were Haman's 10 sons, whose names are carefully recorded in chapter 9, verses 7 through 10. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vajazatha, the 10 sons of Haman son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The Jews followed Mordecai's instructions exactly. They defended themselves and destroyed their enemies, but they didn't take any of the wealth they were legally entitled to claim. When the king heard the results from Susa, he was amazed at the complete reversal. Chapter 9, verses 11 through 13 record his conversation with Queen Esther. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will be granted." "If it pleases the king," Esther answered, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles." The final tally was staggering. Chapter 9, verse 16 tells us, "Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder." Across the entire Persian Empire, 75,000 people who had planned to destroy the Jews were themselves destroyed, while the Jewish people survived and thrived. After the victory, Mordecai and Esther realized that this incredible story of deliverance needed to be remembered forever. They couldn't let future generations forget how God had turned sorrow into joy, mourning into celebration, and certain destruction into complete victory. Chapter 9, verses 20 through 22 describe how they established the celebration. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. The festival would be called Purim, named after the pur, or lots, that Haman had cast to determine when to destroy the Jewish people. The very method he used to choose their destruction date became the name for their celebration of survival. Chapter 9, verses 27 and 28 explain how permanent this celebration would be. The Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year, in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation, by every family, and in every province, and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. This wasn't just a one-time celebration, it was meant to continue forever. Every year, Jewish families would gather to tell this story, eat special foods, exchange gifts, and give to the poor. They would remember how one woman's courage and one man's faithfulness had saved an entire people from extinction. Chapter 10, verses 1 through 3 describe Mordecai's final legacy. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. The man who had once sat humbly at the palace gate became one of the most powerful leaders in world history, using his influence to protect and serve his people for the rest of his life. If this story has opened your eyes to see God's hand in ways you never noticed before, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss when we dive deep into scripture like this. And here's what I want you to do right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that no matter how impossible their situation looks, God is still writing their story. The same God who turned Esther's crisis into triumph, who transformed Mordecai's mourning into celebration, who changed a decree of death into a festival of life, that same God is still working today. Sometimes his greatest miracles look like coincidences, and his most powerful interventions happen through the courage of ordinary people who choose to trust him at exactly the right moment. Don't let this story end here. Share it. Let others discover how the God of Esther is still the God of today, still positioning people for such a time as this.